Right, happy Friday everyone. I am going to hopefully be chatting with Destiny very shortly. He's currently finishing up a game of Call of Duty. I haven't played the new one yet. It seems a bit PUBG-like, which seems intriguing. I played that a while. Anyway, I'm going to be chatting with him about existential risk, and specifically I'm going to be presenting the argument that climate change and nuclear war aren't the biggest existential threats that face our species. So, assuming everything is working properly, which I think it is, should be ready to go. So I'll just listen in on his stream until he's ready to go.
We do have focus arm.
Can you push this other guy with me?
Wait, did we kill two?
Oh, we got them all. We got them all. Okay, we see two other on you.
Yeah,
Really
so
close.
my two arguments are going to be,
Northeast?
first of all, that
Yep.
climate change
They're
isn't
running
the
us down
biggest
right now.
existential risk.
He's peeking this corner.
Climate change and nuclear war aren't.
You sure they're not on the roof?
100 million%. I thought I saw him peeking. Did I not see him peeking?
And second, that we should push to mitigate existential risks,
Oh my God.
based on the premises that people in the future matter greatly, that there are major risks that threaten
Alright, Dan.
future people,
gotta
That's how we die if we push them.
which are
gotta-
currently
let's
receiving
just
relatively little attention,
do this.
and we have plausible ways of affecting those risks
Yep,
and
they're both
of
just on the roof.
discovering
How many
as yet
floors is this?
unknown risks. So the conclusion is that we should push for policies that radically increase research and mitigation efforts into existential risks. So obviously this is going to
Jump.
be a little bit longer than that. I'm going to go through each
One jump off.
Yeah.
point in this and try to break it down, and hopefully we'll have a
let's just
productive
run.
discussion
You gotta, oh, there's still one up there.
with
Yeah, he might have
help
jumped up to
from
this door.
Anders Sandberg and a couple of other people working in the field.
Go.
I'm not sure if they'd want their name shared, but thank you if you're one of the people who I've chatted to about this, have helped me craft this argument a bit, though of course any mistakes
Can't spot the
are my
keys.
own.
Can't spot.
Oh hey J-Tibbs, thank you. I hope it goes well. I'm not anticipating this to
Yes.
fall apart
Jesus,
into,
fuck.
you know,
Seems like
a
I'm
big
the only one that checks
angry
it, so
argument or
people show
anything.
up and-
Wait, I see
I'm
people.
obviously not planning on
163,
insulting
45 meters
Destiny,
So they're
or
in that building. They're just going to the other roof.
accusing him of bad faith or anything.
Out. No.
And I've kind of hung this around the, well, unless he does engage in bad faith, but I have no reason to expect that he will. So I've kind of hung this around.
Might be on the ground.
He's previously claimed a couple of
there's fucking
times
stairs.
that climate change and nuclear war are the biggest threats facing our species, and while they are certainly major threats, I would
Wait, did he just jump up?
argue they're not
I see him on the
literally
roof.
the
I see
biggest
him on the
risks
Wait,
that
there's a guy right
are
behind us, Dan! Dan, right behind
going
us!
to wipe us out. What's going on?
Thank you. Can you pick me up?
Destiny seems a bit
I
grumpy
heard the
at
door
Dan.
open and I'm like, what the fuck?
Um,
I'm armoring, hold on.
I do empathise somewhat with Dan's position because
There's
I've
a
been
precision
the
airstrike. I'm gonna use it on
shitty
the
player on the
flare.
team, frustrating people plenty of times.
Oh yeah.
Though I haven't played
Adam
any
broke his armor?
first-person shooters in a couple of
You
years,
wanna
really.
chase, or-
Yeah, sure. Fuck it. Let's start.
Indeed, J-Tibbs, this is a good point, and I had a stream with a couple of days ago, or, well, on Monday, with Anders Sandberg, where we specifically delved into arguments from the perspective of egoism, because I don't think Destiny will accept the population ethics arguments that the very kind of academic utilitarian arguments that, though I think are very persuasive, if one doesn't accept utilitarianism in its kind of strict, you know, person neutral, individual neutral form, then they're not necessarily that persuasive. And yeah, I think that Neon Goblin, that's absolutely true. That a lot of people do view things from personal perspective, and I'm uh, sympathetic to egoism, and most of what I do is ultimately for my own benefit. You know, a lot of the reason why I like engaging in altruism and charitable stuff is that it makes me feel good. Um, I think there are trade-offs I would make that would be kind of truly altruistic in the sense of be overall subjectively bad for my welfare in order to further the welfare of others, but I would tend to try to balance those factors. Whereas, yeah, Destiny tends to
What are
argue
the
it
other major
from
differences?
the perspective of it's kind of only things uh, that affect one's own interests that matter. But his go away mixer VIP. Uh, um,
Hold on.
oh, that was my first block. Yay! Um,
Yeah.
Does that mean I'm a real streamer now? Yeah, but Destiny tends to view that uh, some things are good and kind of please him subjectively and are therefore good from his personal perspective because they improve the
You
world
should never tell them to
in
rock because
widespread
people
ways
should
that
go.
end up coming back to widely distributed ways that end up coming back to ultimately benefit himself in some way. Um, And yeah,
I
I
want to do
certainly
this
agree,
because
J-Tibbs,
it's
which is
so
part of the reason why I
fun.
think it's particularly important to have philosophical arguments coming from lots of different directions to really be confident about anything in moral philosophy. Um, there's some really interesting work in moral uncertainty,
Oh, you open it?
particularly by Will MacAskill, who's heavily involved in effective altruism and one of the kind of founders of the movement.
Phil, you're running out in the open now.
Um, so I don't want to mischaracterize McCaskill's position, but I think he would tend to argue that though utilitarianism has a lot of attractive points and it seems to be a pretty compelling moral philosophy, we are limited by our individual capacity for reason, and we are limited to the arguments that we've engaged with and by our kind of hardwired intellectual capabilities and so forth. And there are lots of intelligent people who disagree with us on important points, who would go for a strict deontological perspective, or a virtue ethics perspective, or a non-utilitarian consequentialist perspective. And given that we can't be 100% sure ever that our moral beliefs are the correct ones, or whichever system of morality we think is most plausible is the correct one, we should engage in some degree of humility at the least as to the confidence we can have in any individual moral judgment or any individual moral argument. Therefore, to make solid moral judgments, we should probably have a few different arguments, and anything that we can only construct one solid argument for, we should be at least a bit skeptical of. Um, and yeah, generally speaking, like if you want to get as many people as possible to be persuaded by your ideas, it makes sense to make arguments that you don't necessarily find the most persuasive, as long as you're not doing it in a disingenuous way, of course. But I think it's entirely reasonable to present arguments that you recognise that aren't necessarily the most persuasive personally to you, but which might well be more widely persuasive. And yeah, and even within EA, there's a lot of people who don't take the kind of strictly utilitarian perspective. Um, and beyond that, if I'm, trying to argue to a general audience that we should uh, engage in these or implement these specific policies because it'll save, so many quadrillion lives in the future. I mean, I think that's very plausible, but there's a lot of kind of layers of abstraction one needs to go through, and then there's plenty of fundamental disagreements that one can have over that are perfectly reasonable, but nonetheless lead someone to completely different view sets. sure my glucose levels stay adequate. Aha, a message back from Destiny. Right. So yeah, I think he's just going to finish up this game, hopefully.
Oh, he's going right. Center, right. Center. Going near spawn now. He's in your spawn.
But yeah, so I've got several arguments that I think are going to be hopefully persuasive that I'm going to uh, bring up. Oh, thank you very much, J-Tibbs. That's lovely of you. That's very kind. Um, yeah, well, hopefully I'll... oh, yep. Alright, am I ready to go? Looks like we're going to be starting imminently. I think I think there's a variety in kind of utilitarian arguments or a variety of reactions because some of them, the general
Oh, this
idea
is so
that
stupid.
like all else being equal, we should do the most good possible. That's like a really intuitive argument, um, and I think it's both backed by a lot of solid philosophical points, but also it just makes sense. You know, if you've got £10 and you can use it to help one person or 10 people, and those 10 people are going to get just as much benefit as that one person, then it just makes sense to go with the 10 people. You know, sorry, other one person, sucks for you, but just helping more. Um, but then it does lead to some conclusions that are very counterintuitive, um, for many people at least. And some of those conclusions are probably things like the naive reading of utilitarianism, um, for example, is might say that we need to disassemble, we need to have surgeons taking people's organs in order to help the most um, or do the most good by killing one person to save many. Now there are more deep,
Oh, let's invite you
I
back.
think, meaningful reasons why we shouldn't do that, like it would discourage people from going to doctors generally, so that probably the overall supply of organs for transplantation would go down. And it's important that people have a trusting relationship with their doctors for various health outcomes and blah blah blah. But um, just on that kind of surface
Oh, we could
level,
just keep
there
using
is
that.
a counterintuitive um, conclusion that no, I'm not sure. No, that's not a very good point. No, ignore that point. Um, in that specific instance, but say with the long-term future stuff, it might be the case that if one makes the strictly utilitarian argument, and one that I generally buy, that we should be putting far, far, far more resources into saving people millions of years in the future. That is a pretty counterintuitive conclusion for many people when we've got so many problems here on Earth right now. Um, that you get some kind of negative reaction to it sometimes.
Look where that guy's
And
heading.
I think, like I say, I think we should have lots of arguments to make that conclusion if we're going to, because if we want to vastly increase the resources spent on averting future disasters, then we uh, will necessarily need to do less to help current problems, assuming there's some level of trade-off, which there almost always is. Um, and it becomes difficult to argue
Do you have a gun?
against uh, just on the basis of a purely utilitarian outlook. It becomes difficult to argue with people who are saying, but what about the people suffering in the developing world, and what about all these important rights-based causes that we might not be able to prove the benefit of, but nonetheless seem
Oh, get the
important?
balance, okay?
And
Got it.
that's exactly why I think we need to have this variety of compelling arguments to make our case. And as Sandberg was talking about this recently on my stream, as he talks about sometimes because it's a very good point, is we want to have this for important policy decisions generally. So, like in the case of the Large Hadron Collider, there were some reasons to believe, not necessarily great reasons, but some reason to believe that it could cause a rapidly expanding black hole that would suck in the Earth and kill us all, which is obviously a very, very bad outcome. Now, the calculations based on the energy levels involved done by the physicists put a very, very, very low probability
Oh, behind me.
on
Ah.
the black hole occurring and swallowing up everything and killing us all. And that's somewhat reassuring, except for the fact that those calculations could be wrong. And even if they say there's a 1 in a trillion chance of this occurring, the probability that any given physics theory is wrong is probably more than that. Now, fortunately, there are other sources of evidence such as the fact that higher energy events occur in the upper atmosphere all the time. So there are other sources of evidence to make us believe this wouldn't happen. But we want to not just be relying on a single calculation. We want to have those various different converging sources of evidence to actually be confident. Oh, he's ending COD now. Yeah, JTibs, that's probably true for certainly a non-trivial set of current problems. Right, let's to remember to turn to mute this before I go starting. JTibs, you on that Brian Kaplan stuff with regards to education? I'm not sure what I think about all that. I hope that throwing more money at education works, but it seems like the most important thing is to, well, I don't know, I'm not an expert in education.
Do you appreciate me?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Let's get ready. Right, I've got my big long list of sources here, which I will try to bring up on this screen throughout the discussion. I've got my core argument here for everyone to see. And
What about me too?
that's
Uncle
low.
Fatty the obese monkey.
Right. Not long now, I think. Quite exciting. Speaking to more than
How do you
3,500
change the?
people.
What is the duo command?
Kenneth.
Now we have some poggers. Right. Let's see. Hello.
Hey, what's up? How you doing, bud?
Hey, not bad, thanks. How are you?
Pretty good. How's life?
Yeah, it's actually a lot better than when we last chatted last month. In part thanks to my having an interesting intellectual project to work on, i.e. my streaming. So I need to thank you a little bit for that because you kind of gave me a bit of impetus to go off and do that.
Cool.
and also want to thank whoever it was in chat who, at the time, I was kind of going, yeah, maybe I'll start a stream, and they sort of said, just fucking get off your ass and do it, and that did contribute towards my doing it. So thanks to random person in chat.
Nice. Well,
Um,
that's cool.
yeah. So yeah, basically I got in touch because you've previously claimed a couple of times that climate change and nuclear war are probably the greatest threats to human existence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, would you broadly stand by that still?
Yeah, I think so for sure.
Okay, fair. Um, excuse me. Well, my purpose today is to convince you that, in fact, there are other sources of risk that have a greater likelihood of wiping us all out, and hopefully then you will, use your platform to spread the good word about terrifying risks that surpass even the challenge of climate change and nuclear war.
Sure. Hit me
So,
up. What do we got?
as usual, stop me if I say anything wrong, and feel free to ask for sources and so forth. Um, so I should first off clarify a couple of things. Um, First of all, aiming to convince you, convincing your followers is necessary, is nice but secondary, and getting a few followers. My own is also lovely but secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I'm talking about a very wide range of bad things here. So I'm sort of, when we compare the bad things I'm talking about to everyday bad things, it's important to get some sense of the scale.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about, you know, the riots going on at the moment and kind of everyday, very important and very worthwhile social and political issues, these are things that affect thousands, millions of people, hundreds of millions, and affect them in very real and important ways. I don't at all mean to be dismissive of these things when I say that they are not as big a deal as literally everyone in the world dying. I'm certainly not downplaying any of these things, and specifically when it comes to, as I'll discuss in a little bit, when it comes to climate change and nuclear war, I don't want to at all give the impression that these are not things that we should be concerned about. Um, these are both topics that give me a lot of concern. I'm more familiar personally with nuclear war risk, but both of them are, hugely important things that we need to take very seriously.
Sure.
Also, I'll be using the Richard Dawkins, Susan Blackmore definition of memes here as presenting it in the selfish gene. Although, if chat wants to misunderstand for the purpose of amusement, I encourage them to do so. Um,
Gotcha.
yeah, so I'd like to kind of split this. I don't know how long you've got to chat. This could take a while, but if you want me to kind of condense things down a bit, I'm happy to, or whatever.
Um, yeah, maybe condense a little bit. I've got other things that I'm doing today too, but I mean, yeah,
Okay,
I
no
mean, you can
worries.
just start. Yeah, just start hitting me up. What do you got?
Cool. Okay, so my first argument is specifically that climate change and nuclear war aren't the biggest existential risks. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, my specific claim is that novel anthropogenic technological developments present greater existential risk to humanity over the next century than climate change or thermonuclear war. I'm primarily arguing for the perspective of biorisk, so these are particularly things like engineered pandemics, um, which are very, very big risks. They're not necessarily the greatest risk. Many people would argue that AI is a greater risk. I'm not going to argue AI is directly, although if you want to get into it, we can, but it just takes a fair bit longer to unpack. And also, I'd recommend if anybody wants to get into that in a bit more depth, Robert Miles on YouTube. He does some very, very excellent explainer vids about the kind of real risks involved in AI and not the, Terminator coming to kill us all kind of, you know, science fiction scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Um, excuse me. But yeah, also my background is in biology, so I'm a bit more familiar with that kind of side of things. So
Yes, I mean, I guess we'd have to unpack how big a threat we think these things are.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so just to kind of categorize what an existential risk is first, is it's the long-term loss of future flourishing of humanity or humanity's successors. So typically we're thinking about that in terms of the death of everyone or so much of the population that will die out anyway soon.
Uh-huh.
But that can include things like we can imagine being trapped into a totalitarian global state that's so bad that lives are not really worth living, and the state's able to, continue itself indefinitely, and we end up with a state that's basically as bad, if not worse, than everyone just dying.
Sure.
Um, so labeling something an existential risk doesn't necessarily mean being opposed to it wholesale. For example, climate change is as a result of greenhouse gases, the emissions of which have, driven economic progress over the last couple of centuries and have done incalculable good for the world.
Hmm.
Nuclear energy provides we can, debate about the economics and whatever, but it provides a relatively safe and very clean source of power, and isotopes are used in medicine all the time. Our understanding of etc. etc. Lots of good things, but nukes are very scary. And this is a general trend of powerful technology bringing about a lot of ways we can modify the world, and we can modify the world in good ways and bad ways. So if we're able to split the atom, we can use that to release a lot of power and do very good things, or release a lot of power and destroy things. Um, and generally, the more powerful the technology and the more flexible the technology, the more concerned we should be about the potentials for it to be used badly. Um,
Hmm.
but conversely, as I mentioned, labeling something as not an X risk, as not an existential risk, doesn't mean it's all fine and great. Um, conventional war is very probably not an existential risk, or at least not much of one. But we don't want um, Syria and Turkey getting locked in a extended fight over the region, even though it's not going to kill us all. Um, so in terms of taking the kind of top level approach, there's a recent book by a philosopher at Oxford called Toby Ord called The Precipice that I would highly recommend, and goes into all of this in much more detail. But the kind of top line view is that he would estimate that uh, all natural sources of existential risk over the next century, probably less than a 1 in 10,000 chance of either ending human life or bringing us to the point that we can't really, grow back to any meaningful state.
Hmm.
Um, which I think is pretty encouraging. So part of that is if we look at things like uh, cosmic risks, so a supernova blowing up relatively close to us and stripping off a good portion of our atmosphere, causing all kinds of terrible effects and potentially killing us all. That would be very bad, but we're actually in quite a safe neighborhood of the galaxy as far as these things go. We're not that close to any stars that look like they could go supernova anytime soon, in cosmic timescales, and it's possible that we haven't noticed one, or that there's a far bigger one brewing further away or something, but it seems very unlikely based on the history of observation. Um, the other kind of natural risk that often springs to mind is asteroids and comets smacking into us, which could be very bad indeed, certainly. But the efforts of so in 1994, Congress signed a bill that aimed at tracking more than 90% of objects greater than 1 kilometer in near Earth orbit. So that's like inside the orbit of Jupiter, say, and at the cost of probably about $70 million by 2011, they achieved this goal. And they're on track for categorizing even smaller ones and starting to identify comets that might potentially intersect with our orbit. And it's actually one of the best examples of how we've mitigated an existential risk, because by identifying these and having a bit of a think about how we could deflect an asteroid or a comet, we've both characterized what was previously a very uncertain kind of range of risks, and we've taken steps to mitigating it should it occur. So those are that's a bit of a success story, and generally speaking, without going too much depth into each one, natural risks, the fact that we haven't, blown up yet is a decent indicator that we're not going to get blown up by them anytime soon. So
Well,
that's,
sure.
I
Okay,
mean,
yeah, wait. So what? Yeah, so hold on. So we just went through a ton of stuff. So I guess
sure, yeah,
so. The original thing that we were at was it seemed like we had threats that were a greater existential risk to mankind than climate change or nuclear
yeah.
war. And
So
now we're kind of exploring other threats that seemed like they might have been big at one point in time, but they're not really that big of a deal. So in
exactly, yeah.
terms, yeah. So in terms of threats that are bigger, you said we don't want to get into the AI one. The other one was a man-made disease. It seems like
Yeah,
neither of these, I guess, focusing. I mean, I could see how that could be a threat, but it seems like we don't currently possess the technology to do the man-made bioengineered pandemic things.
probably we do. So this is the big concern. Uh, if you like, we can kind of skip over how bad climate change and nuclear war are. Um, particularly the nuclear war stuff, I've got a couple of videos on that if anybody wants to go back and watch. But the kind of headline from those is they are bad but unlikely to wipe us all out completely.
Well, wait, let's go back to
Okay,
when,
sure.
yeah, so when we said existential threat, I don't know if I believe there's anything that could truly wipe out all of mankind, save for some catastrophic. Well, theoretically, we could even live without our sun for some number of generations on planet Earth. So, I mean, like, in
Probably
terms of,
not. Um,
I
this,
think we can because I think there's a way to live off of like geothermal heat. I like this would be like this would be
yeah,
a dramatically reduced population, but like in terms of wiping out every single human on the planet,
mm,
that's probably hard. Um,
sure,
but in
yeah,
terms of
absolutely.
like yeah, like I would be like climate change as being like an existential threat such that it threatens the existence of us on this planet, and that we could probably go on to exist, but it would be like in a dramatically different manner.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So
So we're to
okay, go.
some degree we're talking about kind of a degree here. Uh, when we're talking about the degree to which we could survive, um, the key thing to consider is kind of how big a population or how small a population could we feasibly rebuild from.
Mm-hmm.
So, excuse me, when we're thinking about, say, big asteroid strike turns the whole surface lava or sun just disappears or whatever, yeah, we could probably survive with a few teams here and there living deep underground for a few years. But we would have basically no chance of restarting human civilization in a meaningful way. It almost certainly requires, uh, without radical genetic engineering that we don't have, it almost certainly requires a group of at least several hundred
Mm-hmm.
who are capable of, interbreeding to maintain like enough genetic diversity and avoid catastrophic kind of population collapse from
So not
genetic
gamers
disorders.
is what you're saying. I'm just
Yeah.
kidding.
Um,
Okay, so yeah, okay, so you think that climate change doesn't. So
so,
I guess what I'm trying to get off of
mm,
is I don't want to argue like too much in terms of semantics. So like if
sure.
your argument is that like, well, actually the worst case scenario climate change could do is reduce the human population to 10 million, but we could still go on. Like that could
Yeah.
be true. I can't truly know. Like I'm sure the projections for worst case scenario climate change damage is everything from extinction to a billion people continuing to survive and thrive, which is significantly less than what we have now, but still sizable enough to carry on indefinitely until some other disaster strikes, right?
So I certainly don't want to say that there's no chance that climate change would wipe us all out. Toby Ord estimates about a 1 in 1,000 chance over the next century either
Mm-hmm.
wipes us out or brings us to the point that we can't recover and that we'll, get wiped out in the
Mm-hmm.
near future, sort of thing. Um, so the main risks of climate change, the tail end risks of kind of worst case scenarios from the IPCC projections are somewhere on the order of 6 degrees Celsius by 2100, which would
Mm-hmm.
be bad, but and when I say bad, just to clarify, hundreds of millions, possibly billions of refugees, many millions of deaths, massive amounts of disease, hugely disruptive, but um, very far from anything that's going to like come close to wiping us out. The
Well, what about them? Are we not worried about like runaway effects
Yeah,
of climate
yeah. So
change?
this is they're not on the kind of the tail end of the IPCC projections.
Mm-hmm.
They are kind of theorized beyond that. Now those could be bad. And the real you're familiar with fat tails, aren't you? Heavy tails,
My guess is when you
distributions.
say heavy tail, it has to do with when you're trying to do an extrapolation from data that like the end of the data on the right side of the graph can be very far from the high and the low or something, like can
Yeah, exactly.
dramatically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So when we're talking about these risks, we're talking about heavy tail risks, or the
Sure.
distribution of risk is typically a heavy tail distribution, and the very extreme risks are all kind of contained right at the bottom at the end there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there is a possibility, certainly, of a feedback loop resulting from the increased ocean temperatures, release methane clathorates or hydrates
That
on the
causes
bottom of
ice to
the.
melt. That continues to do runaway effects,
Yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
exactly.
Kills trees, etc. Yeah.
So that would probably add another several degrees on top of it, but there is a limited supply of methane hydrate. So even if we burn all the fossil fuels and that all gets released, that's not on its own going to be enough to bring us to the stage that humanity can't survive. What could happen is that could set off a further runaway greenhouse effect, resulting in a hot Earth because water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So we could potentially end up with a situation where that causes a further positive feedback loop, causing probably not like Venus-like temperatures, but something similar that would essentially make us unable to live on the planet's surface. Now, as you say, we might
Mm-hmm.
live in bunkers for a couple of generations, but that would be an existential catastrophe. That would be wiping us out.
Yeah.
Um, the thing is that in the case of climate change, first of all, in order to get to that, we need to be above a warming of 20 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which would even at 20 degrees Celsius, some areas, some meaningful areas of land would still be inhabitable. Again, not wanting to underplay it would be very, very bad, but we would have enough space left to engage in agriculture for millions of people to live, and we would have tolerable enough climates that we could probably preserve, all human knowledge or a good chunk of human knowledge, which is
Sure.
obviously critical to
Yeah,
like
we don't
rebuilding.
disagree. Yeah, I don't think we're going to disagree with
Yeah,
anything down here. The only thing I would say is that like the degrees of like failure along the climate change thing are all pretty horrible.
yeah,
So like
absolutely.
even if we don't go full down to the bottom end of the tail, like halfway would be really horrible.
Oh, very
Um,
much. Yeah.
yeah. So how realistic is the risk of a man-made virus? Like my understanding is that right now we just don't really have the technology to like genetically engineer a virus like that. We're just not at that stage yet for biological research.
Unfortunately, we kind of are. So the thing is, we've had the ability to do it technically for quite some time because we don't just need to rely on transgenic technology. So in the case of engineered diseases, one of the most concerning events that's occurred so far was research at the Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands, where they took H5N1 avian flu, which is normally not at all very transmissible between mammals, which is what it's very, very deadly. Case fatality rate of about 58%, but it doesn't tend to transmit between mammals, including humans. But what they did was using no exotic genetic techniques, just using selective breeding, they managed to get it so that it would transmit between ferrets, and probably, well, there's a good chance that it would transmit between humans. Um, and this was like perfectly reasonable or perfectly legitimate medical research, um, but arguably extremely irresponsible. In this specific project was arguably extremely irresponsible because it was taking existing, relatively easy to implement techniques and demonstrating how it can be used in order to make a pathogen far, far more dangerous. So bird flu, 58% death rate is bad. That would be if that got widely released at least the same degree as COVID-19 is at the moment, we'd be talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dead.
Well, yeah. So like in terms of like taking a virus and making it applicable to a human, like I'm sure to some extent,
Mm,
in terms of everything you're saying, I don't think anything you're saying is wrong. My understanding is that like when we talk about like existential, so like my understanding is that like Ebola could never be an existential threat to mankind,
yeah.
or a virus that has a 50% fatality can never be an existential threat to mankind, because for a virus like that, like it just kills too many people. Like it doesn't have the ability to spread as much.
S-
Whereas like the super deadly things are the things that can spread quite a bit, that have a decent-ish fatality rate, but that basically things that are more transmissible from person to person, especially that could become asymptomatic for some period of time. These are the big things that can like cause like so like imagine like the SARS-CoV-2, like what
Yeah.
we have right now. If the fatality of that was like 10 to 20%, then that would be on the level of like existential threat. I guess it's possible we could find a virus like that and transmit it from like animals to humans, or find a way to adapt it, which would be bad. Sure, I agree with that, of course.
Yeah, so the main thing is you're kind of taking thinking in terms of natural viruses here.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of natural viruses, you're absolutely correct that there is a pretty strong trade-off between the sort of absolute lethality and the transmissibility. But there's nothing inherent in nature that makes it so. So if we want to look at the Black Death, for example, that was hugely transmissible and killed and had very high case fatality rate. We're not sure exactly how high, but certainly not good. And that killed something like 10% of the world's population at the time without the level of transmission we have today.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you can tweak that, if you can tweak, say, Ebola, using that as an example, you could potentially make it more likely to transmit while keeping the same lethality. So even if that was just in terms of extending its eclipse phase, just extending the period while it's infected you and you're potentially transmitting it, but the symptoms haven't arisen yet.
Yeah, so like I can't speak too comfortably about this without being like a biologist. I was gonna know, but like so in terms of like taking an existing disease from an animal population and finding a way to make like the binding protein like attached to a human cell,
Mm.
something like that would seem to me to be possible within the realm of possible science. But when we talk about like extending the dormant phase of a virus so that it's undetectable for some time while it spreads, something like that would require like levels, like an order of magnitude level of sophistication beyond what we currently have. That would be incredibly complicated.
Not
You'd be
necessarily.
talking, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
because when we're talking about extending the eclipse phase, potentially we don't need to do any actual genetic engineering. If we're just mutating samples and testing it in animals or testing it in an appropriate cell culture, we can identify. So when you're talking about modifying a specific protein to enhance or reduce binding to a cell surface
Hmm.
receptor, the effects of that are going to be something like extending the eclipse phase or reducing it or making it more likely to cause an immune response. Or you're talking about two different categories there, the kind of phenotypic or the molecular level of what you're tweaking, and then the sorry, more akin to genotypic, um, and the phenotypic effects of how that change then interacts with the environment and with the organism that it's infecting and so forth. So,
Wait, what exactly did you just say? I don't understand. You
sorry, no,
said that.
no
Can
worries.
you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So, you were talking about two different categories there. You're
Yeah, I'm
talking
talking. Yeah,
about
two. Yeah.
yeah. So, tweaking a viral protein or tweaking some small effect, a small aspect of the physical virus is going to have downstream effects that could include extending the eclipse phase. Although
Oh
extending the
yeah, yeah,
eclipse
it
phase is
could, yeah. But we don't,
yeah,
but like that's like a huge matter of trial and error, right? Like it could theoretically take
it was
like generations to run into something like that, no?
well, it would take many generations of
I mean, I
the
mean, I'm sorry,
virus.
I was using that in terms of
Oh,
timeline,
sorry,
like in terms
yeah.
of human lifespan, like that, like it could take hundreds of years
Oh no,
to
not
luck into one that.
not at all. Like I say, this 2011 study by Dr. Fauci in the Netherlands demonstrated as part of a relatively small research project the the technology to mutate things in vitro at a very high rate is is absolutely available and is easy to do in relatively lightly equipped labs. The more exotic and advanced techniques of actually editing the virus's DNA or RNA or whatever, um, is also increasingly available. So, leaving aside the kind of just like brute force mutations, if you want to start tweaking individual uh, base bases on a viral genome, then currently all you have to do is get a hold of the original virus's genome or write your own. That's been done, creating a viral genome from scratch. You get hold of that genome by Googling for it on any of the widely available databases of these things. You literally write changes into it, A, T, C, G, U, whatever, and then you send it off to one of several online providers who will return a DNA construct to your preferences, which you can then play around with, infect into yeast or into E. coli or whatever model organism you want. Like this technology that exists today that and I get emails for this stuff all the time. Like I get, as someone who's published papers, you just get a lot of spam saying, would you like to buy our viral vectors? These are the best, DNA constructs that you can buy. And some of these companies do have checking procedures in process that will scan for well-known viral genomes or genes that are associated with specific bacteria or things like that, but a lot of them don't. And there's no kind of international agreement or framework to prevent them just selling whatever strand of DNA they want to anybody in the world.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would agree that that's bad if that's happening.
Yep. Um, and the other thing to mention here is that while we are talking about uh, sort of risk today, when it comes to risk over the coming years, so risk today, there's basically zero risk of climate change wiping us out in the next, say, 10 years or year or whatever. But the risk of it wiping us out, a century, 2 centuries down the line, that's not zero, and it's worth being concerned about. The risk of us being wiped out by an engineered pandemic today is not quite zero, but is pretty low. Though I'm painting a scary picture here, it still requires a reasonable degree of technical expertise and funding to get from just a viral construct to kind of weaponizing it. Um, Whereas the risk of nuclear war today is of wiping us out, effectively, is pretty far from zero. Um, I would say, like right now, today, the risk of nuclear war wiping us out is greater than the risk of engineered pandemics.
Mm-hmm.
But over the coming decades, engineered pandemics and generally biological risk is going to become much, much more prevalent. As the barrier of entry goes down to accessing these technologies, as the cost of it goes down, as the institutional knowledge and kind of implicit knowledge to implement these kind of technologies becomes more accessible, and as the technologies become more powerful and attractive for the purposes of legitimate uses, all of these things mean that the risk is going to increase and increase substantially. Um, and so, but one of the big problems here is the fact that, as I just alluded to, a lot of the technologies are dual use, by which I mean technology to edit genome can be used to cure diseases. It can be used to, well, there's a particularly cool project called Open Insulin. I'm type 1 diabetic myself, and a bunch of amateur biohackers who have like basic level of expertise. Some of them have maybe a master's degree or an undergrad in a relevant subject. Some of them just none whatsoever. Are getting together and producing a system for making insulin in a democratized, like widely accessible way that gets past all of the patents and so forth of the big medical companies, and will potentially bring down the cost of insulin in the US by a factor of 100 or more, which would be absolutely wonderful. I'm fortunate to have a ready supply of insulin from the NHS, but for people in the US, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Thing is, the technology to produce insulin can produce any other protein. The machinery that prints out proteins just doesn't give a shit what it's producing. You can stick these things in yeast and they will produce any given string of amino acids. And there's no principal difference between insulin and the prions that cause mad cow disease, or the botulinum toxin, or any of these other complex molecules that can do a lot of damage. And that's without even going into the possibility of using it to produce viruses. Um, so my point here isn't, we should ban everything, because the dual part of dual use means that there's a lot of good to be captured here. And as someone who personally likes having insulin in my body, I don't want to prevent other people from getting access to it. But excuse me.
Hmm.
But the the risk associated with these things is very substantial, and it's the sort of thing that we need to be doing much more about. Um, and critically, it's extremely neglected. So the Chemical Weapons Convention, which obviously, unsurprisingly, handles verification and monitoring and enforcement of chemical weapons, gets about $80 million a year global funding from all the bodies involved. The Biological Weapons Convention gets annually a budget of about $1.4 million, which is less than the typical branch of McDonald's, um,
Hmm.
by about a factor of half. Um, and not only that, but it doesn't have any formal systems for verification, for reporting, for enforcement of the Bioweapons Treaty, and has absolutely no means whatsoever for controlling biological risks like pandemics, engineered diseases, uh, in the context of actors that aren't states. So yeah, that's obviously something that is potentially very much concerning, and I think that uh, there's a good reason to believe that at least over the next few decades or so, that's going to present a lot more risk to, or at least a lot more risk in terms of actually wiping us out, um, but also a fair bit of risk in terms of potentially causing, millions of deaths, but not coming close to that over the coming century or so. What do you think?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's possible. I get we shouldn't bioengineer viruses in labs. I don't know how much I can protest against that or do about that, but yeah, I mean that seems like a bad thing to do if we can do it.
So yeah, I guess. So does that count as my winning a debate?
Yeah, I guess so.
Sweet,
If it's
cool.
possible, sure.
Okay, so if we can't do anything about it, that's like admittedly a big problem. Um,
Hmm.
so my second argument is more focused around pushing for policies that mitigate for existential risk.
Hmm.
Um, so I've got three premises. People in the future matter greatly. There are major risks that threaten future people, which are currently receiving relatively little attention.
Hmm.
And we have plausible ways of affecting known risks and of discovering as yet unknown risks. With the conclusion being, therefore, we should push for policies that radically increase research and mitigation efforts.
Hmm.
I guess first off, do you disagree with any of those premises?
No, probably not.
Okay. Um, would you agree that someone living, say, 100 years from now has comparable moral worth to someone living today?
No, I'd say there's probably a little bit more to a person living today.
Okay, but you would say there's a bit of a discount, but not a huge one, or there's a large
Mm,
discount?
I would say there's a bit of a discount, but not a huge one.
Okay.
Well,
Um,
maybe that's a really complicated time type of calculus.
yeah, I would certainly agree. I wouldn't like to present this as being an easy um,
Hmm.
decision. Are you familiar with Derek Parfit's work at all?
No, I feel like I've heard the name though. Parfait.
He's a utilitarian philosopher. He's kind of
Okay,
mainly known for his work on population ethics and the kind of value of future people.
gotcha.
Um, but yeah, with I guess without going to that knowledge, because I can't make his arguments especially well. Um, you also vaguely agree with uh, the veil of ignorance.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
Philosophically, yeah, sure.
Would you agree that it applies temporally as well as kind of geographically?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Okay, cool. Um, all right. Well, this is a bit easier than I expected because I was expecting you to take more of a solid kind of egoist stance. How does this fit in
Well,
with
that's
your?
why I'm saying it's going to
Hmm,
depend on what type of time discounting we're talking about, right?
okay.
Because
Yeah.
if there's very little to no time discounting, it almost feels like you could make arguments for like enslaving the entire human population now to create a significantly advanced world in the future for like a future generation or something like it. Like you
Hmm,
could get into weird arguments like that, or that like right now we could harvest the kidney forcibly from every single human being for future humans or something like some weird
yeah.
argument like
Yeah.
that. That's why that when you say time discounting for future
Hmm,
lives generally I actually generally don't really take into account like future lives that much at
hmm,
all into consideration because it seems like you run into a lot of really weird philosophy problems like antinatalism and shit if you
yeah.
try to do that. But I mean like reasonably we must so right even if just for the people that exist right now and the children of those people. So
Yeah.
but
Absolutely.
yeah, okay, so yeah, go for it. Well, I'll see where you're running with it, but I mean like tacitly like it seems like I would have to imagine that the veil of ignorance is temporarily applied. It would seem to be the case. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So essentially, if we accept that there's at least some degree of application of it, then we've got to
Hmm.
accept that people in the future matter greatly.
Hmm.
Um, and we've already gone through, so for premise two, that there are major risks that threaten these people. Um,
Hmm.
we have already gone through a lot of the risks, and I have persuasively convinced you that that maybe engineered pandemics is something that we should be worried about, and of course climate change and nuclear war. Not to put a damper on those either. They might have only a 1 in 1,000 chance of killing us all of killing us all over the next century, but like 1 in 1,000 is um, uh, still not great odds. So
Hmm.
like um, the just to expand on the kind of uh, the importance of these risks. So first of all, they're not necessarily like independent. Some of them are correlated, some of them are anti-correlated. Um, but more importantly, they're extremely neglected. Um, if you look at the overall spending dedicated to, uh, oh yeah, if you want to, sorry, someone in my chat saying list of sources. I'll just like link the my preparation document. Um, don't think there's anything in there that's hugely embarrassing. Uh, so just link that in my chat and link that to you if anybody wants to like have a look. I've got a bunch of sources and stuff linked here. Um, but yeah, so currently the annual spending on total on biosecurity, natural risks, AI risks, and nuclear war is somewhere in the low billions. About 100 million of which is on focused existential risk research versus approximately $60 billion spent on ice cream worldwide every year. Now, like, I'm a big fan of ice cream, obviously, maybe not as much as Joe Biden, but still, it's pretty good. But the fact that we're spending, uh, you know, orders of magnitude more on something that's relatively trivial, and you can make that comparison for any of a number of things, um, suggests to me that we should probably be spending a bit more on it. Um, which kind of brings us on to I think that the area you might find uh, uh, quite interesting, which is the practical stuff that we can actually do. So the ways that we can reduce risk in meaningful ways, and the ways that we can like all plausibly call for um, our policymakers to reduce these risks. Um, so you've spoken previously about like the whole Trump pulling out of nuke deals and so forth, which
Hmm.
which I like to hear. So like obviously that's an area that we can very directly engage with by voting Biden. Um, it's not likely that Biden would have pulled out of the JCPOA, the INF, the Open Skies, and he wouldn't
And the
be.
WHO that Trump just said today we were
Yeah.
terminating our relationship with. So yeah,
Oh shit, has he said he's completely terminating the relationship?
I believe so. Yeah, I think that was said
Oh,
today, an hour
fucking
ago.
hell. Okay, yeah, so there's another one. Um, like the WHO, for all its problems, and it's not like it's immune from political influence. Obviously, it's a political organization, run by the international community. But he's trying to both complain that it's being controlled by China and too political, and remove US involvement from it, which
Hmm.
I I mean, I suppose none of the stuff in Trump world really makes sense, but Jesus
Hmm.
fucking Christ. Um, so I think that's a really strong example of how a vote to say screw the system and we don't like Hillary and whatever other arguments, economic anxiety and so forth.
Hmm.
Um, it was a vote that has, in very real ways, made the world substantially more dangerous. So if we get another, COVID-19, another wave of infections, a flu that's even worse, or an engineered pandemic that's worse still, just to emphasize, COVID-19, not an engineered pandemic. Um, but if we did get something like that, we would be heavily reliant on uh, the WHO to start coordinating responses and making us not like all fucking die and doing research. But unfortunately, the US, previously the global leader in this, is pulling out. Which, yeah, if I were to ask for kind of one general thing, and this is part of the reason why I wanted to speak with you about this, because you are very you're very serious about international cooperation and like not just becoming isolationist and insane. And you've talked previously about some of these conventions, because if there's one thing we can do, it's more international cooperation, more arms control treaties, more funding for the bioweapons convention, more research to identify these threats. Like that's the biggest thing that we can be doing, and specifically asking, when you have members of Congress or hopeful members of Congress on to talk, you do sometimes mention climate change and nuclear war, but mentioning I think biorisk as well, and considering it as one of these big scale threats that we really need to consider seriously, um, and kind of thinking about risks in terms of, I mentioned last time we were chatting, neglectedness, tractability, and impact. These kind of three scales to consider risk in, and
Okay.
um, trying to weigh up risks based on uh, those three factors is both something you can do personally that is good and I think fosters good thinking, but more importantly, it's something that you can press policymakers on and try to spread more in the thinking when we are comparing these kind of big risks. Um, so, like, as far as yeah, I guess, what would you see as um, what would you see as the main risk that oh, sorry, I just brain farted.
No, that's fine.
That wasn't a question. Um, so yeah, as far as policy options go, though, um, uh, sorry, someone in my chat
What are
just
like
saying,
the what's like the best way to go forward, like in terms of policy for
yeah,
international cooperation? Or yeah, I mean, like generally favoring people that have like a more globalistic outlook is probably superior to favoring those that are more isolationist or anti-globalist or whatever they call themselves. Yeah.
yeah, um, and in specific treaties, the Paris Climate Accord, like I say, climate change might not be the biggest risk of completely wiping us out, but
Mm-hmm.
um, is still very much worth considering, and can act in a way to exacerbate other risks. So while I've kind of presented this as engineered pandemics and nuclear war and climate change, in reality these affect each other. Um, if climate change gets worse, it makes nuclear war more likely because conflict is more likely. A nuclear war would knock out our healthcare systems and make us more vulnerable to any kind of pandemic, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I certainly don't want to say that your kind of advocacy and activism so far has been poor, because you've done a hell of a lot better than most of kind of raising these big picture issues. But as something that's becoming increasingly risky, and as something that's maybe not as certainly not as widely discussed, and maybe not as intuitively obviously super terrible as climate change or nuclear war, I think it's really well worth considering things like pandemic risk, and trying to get more people serious about funding them, trying to get more people serious about researching them, and kind of bringing them up to the same kind of space that we think about things like nuclear war and climate change. Um, so yeah, that would be my so going back to the top of my kind of argument here. Um, People in the future matter greatly. We broadly agree on that. It's
Mm-hmm.
something I discuss about. Um, there are major risks that threaten future people. Whether or not we think that engineered pandemics are the worst one, we can certainly agree that there are a lot of big risks, and that there are probably some that we don't know about as well, which is why research is important. And three, we have plausible ways of affecting them. Sorry, and we have personal ways that we can like spread the message. So you personally can, like I say, introduce it into standard arguments, call on politicians and public figures to talk about this. People in chat, if they're interested in figuring out how they can use their career to do good, um, and like address big picture topics like these, I'll link you. There's a link to an organisation that does kind of career counselling and career advice called 80,000 Hours, which does a lot of stuff related to kind of existential risk. And this particularly if you've got a background in STEM, do consider policy work as well, because we need more science literate people doing policy things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and of course, donating to relevant organisations such as the Effective Altruist Long-Term Futures Fund that funds research and messaging surrounding this topic. Um, and if you're interested in these ideas, come follow me and watch my stuff. But more importantly, like talk about it, donate to these organisations, and I think both you personally, Destiny, and everybody out there in internet land have a think about how you can use your life and career and resources to better impact uh, the wider world and reduce the risk of us all dying.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh,
Um,
so do you have any questions? Or I realise that was a bit of a kind of info dump, and I do appreciate your giving me the time to go through my arguments. But yeah, any like questions or criticisms or whatnot?
no, I don't think so. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's anything very disagreeable. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
That,
All right, well, I will certainly count that as an epic debate showdown versus the great and evil Destiny. Um, but
gotcha.
yeah, I very much appreciate your having me on, and uh, yeah, chat saying Destiny's so rude in this day. I know you're just completely bad faith, man, or so bad faith. Um,
Thanks. I try.
but yeah, thanks very much. That was good, and yeah, please do continue, talking about important things and sort of fighting the good fight. And yeah, if you want to have me on any other time to, chat about sciencey stuff or give you another lecture, then I'd be up for that.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it, man. Have a good
All
one.
right, have a good one too. Bye.
Bye.
Oh yeah, hello. Right, I accidentally clicked stop stream instead of stop Discord call, so I'm just gonna check I'm actually online again. Oh, excuse me. Ah, well, I think that went reasonably well. Yeah, J-Tibbs, I could have engaged him um, a little bit more, engaged him in kind of direct discussion. I guess it's I was reading the Twitch chat just now, which isn't really the canonical one, I suppose. But yeah, I could have engaged him in a little bit more back and forth discussion, but hopefully people found that enjoyable and interesting. And so yeah, 80,000 hours, and here's the um, link to the Far Future Fund. Just got infinite me's. Uh, so yeah. Well, this is the most viewers I've had, and that's increased my follower count substantially. That's nice, but more importantly, I managed to have a discussion about a very important topic. So yeah, I'm pleased with that. And thank you for new people starting to follow me. I appreciate that. Um, so if anybody's got any questions or critiques or basically anything except for terribly mean abuse, I would appreciate that. Um, nice, J-Tibbs. Yeah. Thank you for helping me with that, by the way, Jay. I was reading my own chat throughout that and trying to put some of your suggestions in. Yeah, there definitely was a bit of droning on. Um, like I say, I was mainly focused around trying to persuade Destiny personally, but um, honestly, I got a little bit thrown by the fact that he just accepted the future people matter point without disagreement, which makes sense. I just didn't know which way he would go. I thought he might take a more personal approach to his kind of his egoism, but turns out he's willing to accept sort of the I think the veil of ignorance argument is quite powerful, not least because he previously stated it. But yeah, I certainly on this channel, those of you who are watching, I will be doing stuff that's focused more around kind of engaging material for a general audience. So hopefully some of you will watch that and enjoy. Um, yeah, right. Um, uh, Okay, I think I'm going to go and unwind a bit now, but and let you get back to watching Destiny. But I will be online every 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 8 p.m. UK time, which is midday US West Coast time. On Mondays and Wednesdays, I usually do some kind of discussion, typically with a guest. If you look back through my previous videos, you can see lots of my interesting guests. Thanks, J-Tibbs. Really appreciate your input and support. And yeah, thanks. Um, so yeah, Mondays and Wednesdays are kind of like a serious chat, and then Fridays are usually my more frivolous chat where I make a cocktail and play some Fallout New Vegas or something like that. Um, so yeah, thank you very much everyone for your responses and support and everything. And uh, I mean, I could try milking the fact that I've got more viewers now, so I can get the affiliate thing quicker. But No, I won't. I won't insult your intelligence. I haven't got any more specific content planned. And yeah, so I'm just going to bugger off. Everyone have a nice evening or afternoon wherever you are in the world. And yeah, see you later.